Okay, welcome back, everybody. We're going to start to take our seats for our second and final panel. I think the last discussion really teed up nicely the topics that are going to frame the discussion next. And as you've seen throughout the day, one of the common themes is just the sheer diversity of actors, not just in the US innovation ecosystem, but globally. And it requires governments to be able to act nimbly and to forge partnerships with industry, with academic research centers. And to do that effectively, you need, I would say, three big things. We need clear vision, clear communication, and the ability to convene. And not just to prepare for what we're facing today, but for future contingencies that might look very different. And we are so fortunate to have in Emelia Probasco somebody who really exemplifies and excels at all three of those tasks. She is a Rhodes Scholar. She's a surface warfare officer in the Navy. She served with the CNO. She's had a whole variety of interesting roles, including at the Applied Physics Laboratory as a communicator, as a policy innovator. And if you really want to understand what trustworthy AI is all about in practice, I highly recommend her work. It's done a lot to uncover the different terminology and what it means in different contexts, extremely important in light of the recent executive order on AI. So we have a fantastic panel that's going to look at public-private collaboration with respect to the war in Ukraine, but also beyond, and to look at all sorts of issues related to messaging, legal foundations, pre-supply of equipment, contracting. I think this is going to appeal to a lot of you and will connect a lot of the themes that we've talked about today. So without further ado, Emelia, the floor is yours.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Yeah? Thank you for sticking around. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for that incredibly kind introduction, Andrew. I'm hoping we're going to end today on a bit of a bang, but a metaphorical bang, because we have people who know how to do that here. We've had a lot of great conversations. I want to thank in the last panel, the last question from the individual from the Ministry of Digital Transformation in Ukraine set up this panel really well. So we've been talking, I think DC in general has been talking a lot about the impact of new emerging technologies in warfare. And there were years ago when Secretary of Defense Ash Carter set up the Defense Innovation Unit with the intent of making commercial technologies more readily available to DoD. He knew, and I think this was pointed out earlier, that so much R&D is not happening in the government labs anymore. It's happening in the commercial sector. And with things like the Defense Innovation Unit, they wanted to set up a way to get at it. And while I think Secretary Carter was a genius and prescient in setting up DIU and some of these other initiatives, I do not think they could have foreseen what would happen several years later in Ukraine, where we have something that I think is a bit different. We certainly have emerging technologies playing a huge role in Ukraine today, everything from commercial drones, satellite imagery, communication services, cyber services. But I think a step more than that, and what this panel will get into, is that it's not just the emerging technologies, it is also the emerging technology companies. And I think this goes to the question that was asked earlier. Most of you have heard the story of Elon Musk and Starlink. That was the most publicized of the many different examples where Elon Musk is asked by the Ukrainian government to basically stop going after Mars and activate Starlink. And he very famously does so over Twitter several hours later. But he's not the only one, not the only commercial technology company that delivered what I would call combat-relevant technologies to Ukraine. They include Amazon, Microsoft, Google. These are places that companies that you know. Also smaller ones like Capella Space or Maxar. And then even smaller companies like Clearview AI, which delivered its facial recognition technology, or Primer AI, that was capturing, translating, and transcribing some of the Russian unencrypted transmissions. In some of these instances, it looked like it was a CEO making a decision over Twitter. And sometimes, and this was confirmed in the press, these were donations by companies. They weren't under contract. They were not necessarily expecting to be compensated. But these are new things. This is a new way for a company to get involved in conflict. And so I'm really excited to have this panel of experts to talk about what exactly is happening. And each of them represents a different perspective. So that's why I'm so excited to have each of them. Let me start with Colonel Joe O'Callaghan. Colonel O'Callaghan lends to this panel real on-the-ground experience and firsthand familiarity with how technology is shaping combat operations today. He currently leads the integration of new technologies, in particular artificial intelligence for the 18th Airborne Corps. If you're not familiar with the 18th Airborne, they are what we tend to call America's Contingency Corps. They're the ones that go in first to mobilize in the event of a crisis. His firsthand experience includes operation in Bosnia-Herzegovina twice, Iraq also twice, and Afghanistan. And he's commanded Army batteries and battalions. He served in the mechanized, the airborne, and the joint special operations units in combat, peacekeeping, and operational deployments. He is a qualified master parachutist, a graduate of the Army Space Cadet Program, and has completed multiple Army and joint educational courses. So he brings a really recent on-the-ground experience to our discussion. We've also got Mr. Pablo Chavez. Pablo comes with experience across the tech sector, as well as on Capitol Hill. He was the Vice President of Global Government Affairs and Public Policy for Google Cloud, Microsoft's General Manager for U.S. Public Policy, LinkedIn's Vice President of Global Public Policy and Government Affairs, and then before that, he was the Senior Counsel for the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, and Chief Counsel to Senator John McCain. He's currently an Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Center for New American Securities, Technology, and National Security Program, where his research focuses on the impact of emerging tech-related laws, regulations, and policies on national security and economic development. And then to round out all of our experience, we have General John Allen, who brings a strategic perspective, having been on both sides of this equation. He retired from the Marine Corps as a 4-star general, having served as the commander of the NATO International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. Immediately following his retirement from the military, was that days, sir, or did you have a couple of minutes? Days? Days of retirement. He served as a senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense on Middle East security and subsequently served as the President's special envoy to the Global Coalition to counter ISIL. Over his career, he has experienced combat from the Caribbean to the Balkans to the Middle East, and he also served as the Principal Director of Asia-Pacific Policy in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Today, General Allen is the strategic advisor to Microsoft and a member of the Microsoft Advisory Council, as well as the Microsoft Technology and National Security Advisory Council. He's a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, was appointed by President Biden to the Naval Academy's Board of Visitors, and he also advises several tech startups somehow all at the same time. But hopefully you can see why I'm so excited, because they represent 3 very different perspectives that I think are important to this particular conversation. And what I'd like to do is actually start with Colonel O'Callaghan. If you can talk a little bit about, you're on the ground, you see what's happening in our Army, you see, and you've been in this before Ukraine contingency happened. What is going on with technologies? How is it changing the way warfare is fought? And can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, Emmy, really appreciate being here. We're in a different world today. And if you turned on the TV a year ago and you turned on the TV today, it's the difference between looking at a flip phone in combat to what would be, say, a modern iPhone or something of that nature. Technology is moving exceptionally quick. And if we're not able to adapt and employ that technology, then we're going to fall behind those who can. And so in a society where we take a very liberal approach, to the employment of technology, and we do it responsibly, really the question is, how do you move rapidly to bring in the best of what a capitalist society has associated with those who are in it, to those companies who are producing within it? How do you take that approach, which is essentially revealing technology, obviously for profit on many things in the commercial sector? How do you apply that into the world of security affairs? And so essentially that's been a question that we've been dealing with now for a couple of years. And really, when you saw Ukraine, you saw why it became so important as you watch the Ukrainians accelerate by taking off-the-shelf technology and bringing it forward. But to do that really has required us in the Department of Defense to have a very open mind. And essentially, we are having to learn at the rate of industry. Industry will really supersede any capabilities that in DoD we had for future. We had in the past as far as acquisition goes. There's no 5-year process to develop a capability within DoD, within commercial industry, that emerges overnight. And so essentially what we're now beginning to see is really an intertwining between the commercial and the government, right? And it's happening in an interesting class of companies. And these are companies that are able to take their commercial wares and capabilities, and they have the capital behind it to accept risk, to work and iterate with DoD. And why that's important is that DoD may be full of the apex predators when it comes to how do you actually fight a conflict. But apex programmers, it is not full of. That's not what we're focused on. And so aligning the apex programmer with the apex predator really becomes a critical aspect because you're going to learn from each other. And by learning from each other, we're able to actually start understanding and having a dialogue that's very fruitful on how to take those capabilities that industry has and move them forward. An example, a very simple example, is cloud. If you look at where DoD was with the majority of its organizations 3 and 4 years ago, it was just basic client-server relationships with hardware. You would field a server, you'd field the clients, and you would work with it. And we had not really revealed the power of cloud. But opening the dialogue with industry of what works best for industry, what has been commercialized and has been capitalized upon, right? Because there's a value in performance in the commercial sector. DoD is able to learn and move very quickly. And so we're beginning to see the fruits of it as an example.
Yeah, no, that's great, thanks. And so you're beginning to see it on the sort of generally across the armed forces in the United States. But Pablo, you've seen it, you observed tech companies get involved in Ukraine and in other places. What does it look like from your end? What have you seen them do that's been impactful?
First of all, thanks, Emmy, for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here with you. True subject matter expert, as was mentioned before. It's also wonderful to be on a panel with 2 gentlemen who are both thought leaders and action leaders in the space. As I was sitting in the back of the room listening to previous panels, I remembered that about almost exactly a year ago, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, the President's National Security Advisor, was standing right there, and then he sat here to talk about the national security strategy. The strategy highlighted the fact that technology, the topic that we're talking about today, sits at the center of kind of the geopolitical advantage that the United States and its allies can build over time. And the technology is fundamental to the development of our economy, of our national security, and of our defense capabilities. And so one thing that the national security strategy talks about is kind of effectively kind of an all-of-government effort along with allies and like-minded partners to engage in and develop technology. A critical component of that, as Emmy's suggesting, is the relationship between government and the private sector. And essentially kind of a current testbed of that is the conflict in Ukraine in the wake of Russia's invasion of the country. I think what I'll do very briefly is both kind of give you a description of kind of what is on the ground in terms of tech companies operating, as mentioned before, largely voluntarily, but also kind of try to organize that information for you so you can kind of, especially the students in the audience, can have a little bit of a framework for how to think about this. So there's a spectrum of activities with a number of companies operating kind of on the ground and remotely. On one side of the spectrum, there is a number of essentially humanitarian activities that are happening using digital networks to provide mechanisms for funding the needs of Ukrainian refugees, for providing housing and providing kind of legitimate information about where to get health care and so forth. And so here it's essentially companies like everything from Airbnb to Google lighting up their networks and enhancing them in order to support humanitarian efforts. So we'll put that here. In the middle, there's essentially kind of a continuity of operations effort that has been undertaken by a number of companies. Microsoft and Amazon Web Services in particular have done really interesting work here. And on Microsoft's side, it has been very, very focused on cyber defenses. It was there even before the beginning of the conflict, helping the Ukrainian government protect both civilian and military assets from Russian efforts to deploy wiper, spyware, and so forth. And then there's a second effort, again, the continuity of government category, where essentially data from Ukrainian government data centers was ported out and put into the cloud outside of the zone of conflict. Very, very important effort undertaken by both AWS and Microsoft. So that's that middle category. The third category, briefly, and probably the main focus of this conversation, is the support that technology companies have provided more on the military operations front. And here, again, there's a little bit of a spectrum from softer support, and that could be, for example, Google and Apple obfuscated some real-time data on their Maps product in order to make sure that civilian movements were not targets for the Russian military, all the way to kind of a middle category where commercial satellite companies were providing images have been providing images to the Ukrainian military, to a more kind of on-the-field support. So, for example, companies like Palantir have been leveraging AI to identify targets and to give essentially commanders in the field the opportunity to kind of see where they should deploy fire. The last thing I'll say very briefly is that there's also, you mentioned Starlink. There are dual use cases that kind of run across these three categories that make the picture a little bit more complicated. So Starlink started its efforts as both an effort to support civilian efforts. I think Elon Musk talked about how it was about watching Netflix, but also focused on defensive kind of military efforts. And so how you treat these dual use technologies is also a little bit of a challenge in these scenarios.
And then just to pick on it a little bit more, can you also say something about some of the information and the disinformation? Because I know you were at LinkedIn and you know a little bit about how that works. Yeah, for sure. And I think that it's a great question. I mean, the propaganda, disinformation, misinformation efforts on the part of the efforts that kind of tamp down on those three categories of information at companies like YouTube, Meta, and so forth, those also kind of span across the spectrum, because some of it is humanitarian. Some of it is to ensure that, for example, in this case, Russian propaganda, is not an advantage on the battlefield, is not an advantage in its competition, in its effort to harm Ukraine. And so that is also, I think, in my mind, another kind of dual use case that kind of spans across those three categories. Oh, thanks. So, General, what do you think in terms of, you've seen this from the strategic level, you observed Ukraine, you've seen many combat operations before. How is technology starting to affect things?
Well, let me first thank you for being on the panel. What Emmy didn't say in our dual introduction here was that she was a midshipman at the Naval Academy when I was the commandant there. And clearly she's risen to overcome that. Second, in terms of technology, where I first encountered emerging technologies that we're talking about here is almost a matter of routine today. It's not yet, but it will be in the near future. was when I commanded the war in Afghanistan. And I began to work very closely with DARPA on the deployment of certain of the capabilities that DARPA had and was developing, some of which were AI related. This is 11 and 12, 13. So this is really the leading edge of the concept of the deployment of artificial intelligence. And the thing that it provided for me was acceleration. I had the capacity, through the various capabilities that DARPA provided me, to sense the battle space across the entire theater more quickly, to analyze and disseminate relevant information more quickly, and then to act more quickly than my opponent. Now, of course, we're dealing with a counterinsurgency, so the idea of speed and acceleration was less relevant than it is to a battle space or a battlefield that looks like Ukraine. But what that did for me at that particular moment as a strategic commander, and it has really, in many respects, shaped my thinking in the future, was as we consider multi-domain warfare in the 21st century and multi-domain conflict, I think we often don't make the distinction between multi-domain conflict and multi-domain warfare. We are in a state of conflict most of the time, where the decisive domains in that conflict tend to trend towards information and the cyber domain. And periodically, as that conflict evolves, it may break out into the physical domain, into something that we have traditionally considered to be warfare. And I think that's an important way of thinking about this, because as we embrace emerging technologies, and if we had the graph here, which is the x-axis would be the passage of time, and the y, or the vertical axis, would be the improvement or the increase in capabilities of technologies for the vast majority of the history of conflict. That line of technology was virtually parallel to and flat and barely above the passage of time. There was very little influence of technology in the acceleration of warfare. But with the development of electricity and then computers and then the digitization of much of our society, and ultimately now with the idea of high-performance computing, fast and comprehensive data analysis, artificial intelligence, this has changed profoundly the environment within which we have to think about conflict and ultimately how we wage war. And so for me, I think a lot about what acceleration means, what that word actually means, not just in the context of warfare, and not just in the context of conflict. I think about it more broadly. We are accelerating the nature of society. What does that mean for us? That's not the nature of this conversation, but as I think about it at a strategic level, what tech companies who wield these technologies, tech companies who develop software at a rate that the government both can't and could never develop at the speeds of private sector entities, particularly technology companies. This is going to have an accelerant effect upon not just conflict, but warfare. And I've written about this in a number of places, and we're beginning to call this the concept of hyperwar, which is war that is moving so fast with the assistance of high-performance computing, the kinds of data that is available and necessary, large language models. Generative AI is going to accelerate this even more. The concept of hyperwar means that we'll be moving so fast that at some point we will have to call into question the role of the human being in the process of decision-making. Now, Clausewitz said there is the character of war, which is the technical dimension, and there's the nature of war, which is the human dimension. And as we see the development of artificial intelligence and the other ancillary capabilities which gives it greater power every single day, we may well find ourselves in the not-too-distant future, because we know that our adversaries are pushing very, very hard in this direction to remove the human out of the decision-making loop in many respects, where there is actually a middle ground between the character of war, the technological, and the human dimension of war, or the nature of war, which would be the capacity for us to bring AI into decision-making capabilities that we've never been able to consider before. But conflict and war is accelerating. I saw that firsthand in Afghanistan. I watched it later as in the Central Command, and I think that the capacity for the Colonel and the 18th Airborne Corps to operationalize the capacity for us to sense, decide, and fight at speeds that we've never seen before, ultimately approaching a zero time phase with respect to decision-making. I think this is a really radical change in how we should think about conflict and ultimately think about warfare and the waging of warfare. We've never had this opportunity before, and I think one of the biggest changes was last October when we deployed the large language models, the ChatGPT. It's extraordinary what that now brings to intelligence professionals, to command and control, and ultimately to tactical commanders. And we're only beginning to see it, and he is the one who's ultimately being tasked with bringing it to reality.
I'm going to have to pick on you now, Joe, but I saw you nodding as John was talking about how this is hyperwar and it's accelerating. Certainly you've seen that. Do you want to comment for a second?
Yeah, absolutely. So the general's right on, has defined exactly where we're at right now. And so we've really begun to understand, with the help of industry, where the future is going, right? This is not something we can do alone. And really we've begun to understand that in warfare, we have the strategic, the operational, and the tactical level of war, and they're beginning to narrow. But conversely, technologically, particularly with data, we have the foundational, the contextual, and the situational levels of war that are now out. And so it's a question now of defining what space, what spaces do we put the appropriate technology against? And so on the foundational level of war, that's where we're beginning to understand what's the background, what's the backdrop. This could be something such as simple as the geodesy, right? The datum of the map that you're working off of. Or it's stuff such as country studies, something that perhaps we could take a large language model and queue if we've done our engineering our queries correctly, state such as what would be the appropriate governance structure at the end state of a conflict with a certain competitor, right? Something that we could actually go out and pull that information together. But at the same time, we understand what the limits are of us both organizationally and as far as equipment goes. And so you're not going to get that data out at the tactical level. You're going to have to go to that foundational level where you can employ that large language model, where you have access to that hyperscale compute. As we go down into all the way down to the tactical level, you begin to understand, I don't necessarily have that cloud access that I may want to have. You may or you may not, but you've got to plan for both, right? And so what kind of compute works at that level? And then that interim level, that contextual level, that's where we begin to really see a lot of where industry becomes helpful, because this is the equivalent of enterprise, right? This is a large-scale company running enterprise-level operations, say a soda company across the entire United States or across the globe, having to project into the future. And so what we're seeing with the evolution of technology and the ability to impart it quickly is we're having to transform the force at the human capital level. And that's becoming the most challenging thing. And that can't be done alone, right? The schooling, the foundations of the military profession don't necessarily have the time or the responsiveness to immediately adapt what industry has learned and project that into the upcoming soldier, sailor, airman, marine, or guardian. We have to rely on industry to help kind of in that interim space act almost as a journeymanship, that once the schools have provided the individuals, that industry is providing the software or the capability or working with us concurrently in what we're evolving or demonstrating or training on to help evolve our understanding of data. Because data essentially is going to be the cornerstone of how we fight in the future. And what's emerging is a concept of what we call adaptive data-centric warfare, right? So data centricity being bring the data together to build for a decision. Adaptiveness being, do we have the right policies and procedures and everything from acquisition to intelligence oversight as an example, regulatory-wise. Do we have all the procedures and regulations in place to support that data-centric warfare as it moves forward?
Let me come in behind Joe. He made an extremely important point about the human dimension in this, the nature of war. And to the point that he made, as technology continues to evolve, and in fact technology outruns our education base to both understand the technology itself and ultimately to apply the technology in the context of conflict and war, it's going to require that the services, the U.S. services, embrace the realities that we're facing both in terms of recruiting, how we school, how we assign, how we promote, how we continue to educate our officer corps going forward. Now, to that end, I had the great honor a few years ago to be with Admiral Blank Mullen representing the two services, the Marine Corps and the Navy, in a Department of the Navy study on education for sea power. And this was a really important study because it embraced exactly the things that Joe was talking about. First, taking an appraisal, an understanding of both what technological challenges we face today, but very importantly, attempting to understand how technology continues to spin. It's not just about changes in technology. It's, in fact, the rate of change of technology, which is actually mind-spinning or head-spinning as you move forward. And understanding that and educating for an understanding of that is going to be absolutely essential, not just in the application of technology, but as it continues to change, understanding the potential of that technology to be applied by the human dimension of our warfighting machine. And let me just make another point. A couple of years ago, I had the chance to lead a study on NATO adaptation in the 21st century. And while it was a comprehensive study and it ultimately talked about hyperwar, one of the greatest concerns that we had wasn't the Russians. We felt that NATO could handle that if necessary. Wasn't the Chinese. We felt that that is an understandable and ultimately a manageable issue. And it wasn't an unstable southern flank to NATO. That, again, is also understandable. The challenge that we faced, and this goes to, if you've been listening to Joe for the last couple of minutes, it's an extraordinarily impressive laydown of what our military is doing today. One of the biggest concerns I had was the United States leaving our allies in the dirt, leaving our allies behind. Because one of the challenges we have in NATO, we talk about the 2%. 2% is 2%. Some countries are paying it. 2%, some are not paying it. But the thing that many of the countries are not doing is modernizing. They're not modernizing with the kinds of technologies we are. They're also not educating to the levels that we are to understand the environment of hyperwar and to educate leaders in other NATO countries to do this. And the United States, the whole concept of NATO is it's an interoperable alliance. And as we continue this march of embracing technology and applying it at the strategic, operational, and tactical level, we have got to bring our allies along. And in that case, what you see is a very different role of European tech companies, both in the military services, European tech companies on the battlefield in Ukraine, and American tech companies as it relates to the American warfighting machine and the American tech companies on the battlefield of Ukraine and other hotspots. It's a very different scenario and a very different paradigm.
So we've talked about how the American military, or how we see conflict in general progressing as a consequence of these technologies. But Joe, you said something that really caught me, which is that you're working with the companies. And this is where, Pablo, I want you to hopefully talk to us a little bit about why do the companies get involved? I think there is companies coming under contract. That's perhaps one thing, and we know that's been a challenge in the past with some of the companies out of Silicon Valley. But they were volunteering here. So what drives companies to want to get involved? And then I want to add a second question after you've answered that about your observations, having worked for global technology companies, about the international state of technology companies and what you see happening internationally in terms of our allies and their sophistication and their ability to bring technology to the battlefield.
Great.
Sorry.
That's a good question.
Can I pause for a commercial interruption?
Yeah.
So for folks in the audience, again, Emmy is the host of this panel, but she's also the thought leader of it. I strongly commend to you a recent Foreign Affairs article called Big Tech at War, right? No, correct me?
Big Tech Goes to War.
Big Tech Goes to War. It's basically kind of like the intellectual foundation for this panel. So if you happen to be taking a mid-afternoon nap and you're not listening to this whole thing, just go back and read that article. You'll learn a lot from it. In terms of your very good question about what precisely motivates tech companies to participate in this, look, every company, like every human, is different, but but there are some commonalities that you can kind of identify across the board. So first, there is definitely the opportunity, for example, in the Ukraine war, to just demonstrate capacity and capability, and that goes from drone manufacturers to cybersecurity companies. It's just essentially kind of like a proving ground. I think secondly, there is kind of probably a larger marketing desire to kind of show kind of capacity both in terms of kind of defensive capabilities and more and kind of on the other side of that equation as well. I think though so those are fairly standard motivations. I think that there are two things that I definitely observed in my time at these companies that it's a little bit more intangible, but is worth noting. So first, conflict, whether it's war or crisis, when you have an earthquake or just a natural disaster, it's always an opportunity for a tech company to kind of show off what it's best at. So on the defensive side, kind of securing infrastructure, securing networks, and then more on the product and services side, like demonstrating how the platform can be used, for good and in an enhanced and perhaps new way. So there's always kind of a little bit of that kind of like product and engineering perspective on this. But the second thing, and I think that this is crucial, and I think that this is actually one of the reasons why there is so much engagement between the private sector and the military, is that in many ways there's a similarity in terms of they are mission-driven organizations. And a lot of people, actually former military, former government, former IC, go and work at companies like Microsoft, Google, et cetera. And they do so because they are very, very mission-driven. And so, for example, everything from the withdrawal from Afghanistan to the current situation in Ukraine, there are people who kind of jump into this and try to use their company's platforms, their company's products to do good. And that is, a very, very common thing that's seen both from, kind of like line engineers all the way up to the C-suite. So I think that is one thing that, again, it's a little bit intangible. I don't have proof for it, but I've seen it, and I think that it's a major motivator. Emmy, on your question regarding tech companies outside of the U.S., is that more kind of like where are they vis-a-vis kind of the American companies, or how would you kind of characterize?
Yeah, I would imagine that in your positions, I know you did a lot of work internationally as well, and so what do you see happening internationally in terms of companies and innovations that are coming out of allies and partners? Because you saw that from a different angle, and question for the whole panel too. You've probably seen technologies coming out of not the United States. So just
yeah. Look, on the more on the commercial side, So speaking specifically about Europe, so Europe has been undertaking a massive effort to try to get capital into technology, try to kind of build up its workforce, and try to build up companies to to kind of compete effectively on the commercial side. I should note as well that there's a lot of kind of regulations that the European Union has been passing that have kind of hampered, perhaps the kind of the innovation of American companies. I think it's one of the challenges to the transatlantic relationship to try to find some alignment there. But I think that the truth of the matter is that in places like, or in verticals like AI, there's a French company, for example, it's called Mistral, that's very, very well funded. Within 4 weeks of its founding, it got a $100 million investment. I think it's up to like $400 million from various venture capitalists and other sources of capital. So there is a lot of effort to kind of build up that industry. I do think, though, again, that the European Union right now is considering the Artificial Intelligence Act. It's kind of in the final phases of that. And I think that there are just a lot of open questions about like how precisely American companies and non-European companies will kind of be part of the single market, and whether they'll be able to kind of be an effective partner in the continent, or on the continent.
And that's a really important question that Pablo brings up, the issue about whether the United States and the EU will be partners going forward, or whether differing regulatory behaviors are going to keep us separate for a long period of time. And as we think about technology affecting geopolitics and geostrategic relationships going forward, we'll have a Chinese regime, we'll have potentially a European regime, we'll have potentially a US regime, we could have an Indian regime, and all of those will be separated by regulatory bodies that could keep us, in the case of the United States and the EU, from creating a kind of synergy with respect to emerging technologies that I think we need for our people, but also very importantly, and I know I'm not going to speak for Microsoft, I can speak about Microsoft. I know that there is a lot of interest in conveying, when someone says AI for good, it's AI for good for humanity, for conveying the ultimate outcome of these technologies to the global south, and to improve those elements, those countries, those populations, by access to the kinds of technologies that can improve their lives, can connect them more strongly into the technological north. And as we see these regimes being segmented by varying regulatory behaviors, it has the effect of separation. The cloud is a real example. There's a lot of disagreement between Europe and the United States, the tech industries, on the employment of the cloud. Europe would say they want to protect the privacy of their citizens, and I really applaud that. I think Europe has done a magnificent job with the GDPR and other type and similar regulatory bodies and regulatory behaviors to protect the citizen of the EU. I really applaud that. But some people say we've done this in order to prevent the predatory behavior of US technology as it might be applied in the continent. We can't go forward in the 21st century with the China challenge out there without the United States and the EU, or North America and the EU, finding a common path together.
Can I back up a little on a similar question that I asked Pablo? Why do companies decide to do this, decide to get involved? If I go back to that question, General, you're on boards, and I imagine, I don't know necessarily for your boards, but for boards in general, this is a discussion that perhaps they should be having. How would you advise those boards to think through these kinds of questions?
Well, the first thing I would ask a board to think about is, how do you think systematically about conflict going forward, and the potential that a conflict could erupt into war? And the way I think about it, the way I advise on it, is think of it in three segments. Companies can be involved in these high-intensity periods in one of three ways. One is in pre-conflict activities that the company can take with a potential client or a potential country that can help to fortify that country's data capacities, protect its networks, the cybersecurity, can do a lot of things in the pre-conflict period, which not only should the conflict ultimately erupt into war, prepare that country to defend itself in war, but actually can create a deterrent effect that could stave off the reality of war within the conflict. So a pre-conflict segment, a conflict segment, which would be how we would think about as a company providing direct support now that that country is at war, and then a post-conflict segment. Each one of those are absolutely vital in considering what a company can do with respect to conflict and war. Each one of them carries with it certain considerations with regard to what a company can do with respect to investment, with respect to the hardening of a country's capacity to resist cyber or information attacks in the pre-conflict period. It can have very serious considerations about, should the conflict break out into war, what kinds of immediate direct assistance can this company provide, whether it's updated software, whether it's actually hardware, whether it can be evacuation of data into the cloud, whatever it might be. And then finally, in the post-conflict period, where we're hoping to move into a period of stabilization, the big American context, and American companies in particular, in that context, can provide a great deal of support in the immediate post-conflict period for the stabilization of the population that's been liberated, or the society that is now attempting to transition from a conflict society to a post-conflict society, ultimately to a peacetime environment. So if I were to advise, it would be, think of the period that we're facing in three segments. What can we think about as a company to do in the pre-conflict period? What can we do if that country ends up going to war? And what can we do in the post-conflict period, ultimately to stabilize the society, restore the quality of life, and help that country to get back on its feet with reconstruction? And if you break it down into those three segments, you have the capacity to begin to think pretty systematically about the things you can do. For example, we think a lot about, and Joe mentioned it and Pablo mentioned it, what Microsoft did for Ukraine was to help them, and it had been a long-term conversation actually, was to help them ultimately evacuate their data into the cloud. And so we now are thinking about data evacuation planning for other countries. Data evacuation planning in the event that you may find yourself in a conflict-like environment which could ultimately erupt into war, and I'm thinking some countries in East Asia. But as we think about data evacuation, and as we think about critical infrastructure, and as we think about targeting in the information domain or targeting in the cyber domain, the advent of data centers, which is really the heart and soul of the capacity to do big data analytics, high-performance computing, and the application of artificial intelligence and large language models in an operational context, it's the data centers that make that possible. It underwrites the capacity of the cloud. But if you now think about data centers in a different way, you think of them as critical infrastructure and targeting sites, we got a problem. I co-wrote a book with a couple of a wonderful Army general by the name of Ben Hodges and a British professor by the name of Julian Linley French called The Future War in the Defense of Europe. It was about a mythical Russian invasion into northwest Europe in the year 2025. We're now starting a second book called Future War and the Defense of the Pacific. And almost immediately, our attention is drawn to the data vulnerabilities of virtually every ally and every advanced economy in the Pacific, and the potential targeting either in the information or the cyber domain, but in the physical domain of the data centers. And what would it do? What would it do to the economies and the societies in that area of operations should the first strikes be to take out most of the data centers and to cut the undersea cables? I mean, it's almost unimaginable when you think about it, but we have to begin to think about that dimension of our critical vulnerabilities going forward. In a pre-conflict sense, how we would deal with it in a conflict sense, and how we'd restore capabilities ultimately in a post-conflict sense. Sorry to go on so long.
No, I think we've got comments on both sides.
A tiny footnote on that for folks who are kind of interested in the kinds of issues that the general is raising. So, the first rocket attacks when Russia was invading Ukraine were actually launched at Ukrainian government data centers, just to highlight and underscore precisely kind of like what the general is saying in terms of kind of the fundamental nature of that kind of infrastructure. And I think that that one thing for students who are focused on this, for example, there's a international humanitarian law element of this, which is kind of the principle of distinction, right? To distinguish between kind of civilian targets and military targets, and all of that in kind of the digital space is getting jumbled. Because precisely the same cable that delivers, humanitarian information is probably also delivering some sort of military capability, and how we deal with that going forward is going to be, a massive challenge from kind of a laws of war perspective.
Okay, just tell a quick,
Tiny footnote to the footnote.
This is the heart of the issue.
A quick story. I was the deputy commander of CENTCOM. I'm forward in the forward headquarters of CENTCOM in the Middle East, and my J6 walks in, the communications director. And he comes in and says, "Sir, I got bad news for you. Somebody dropped an anchor on the cable in the Mediterranean." And I said, "Oh, well, what does that mean?" And it said, "Well, 60% of our access is now down, and we're looking for alternate channels in the constellation." I said, "Well, okay, where's the cable repair ship?" And this was one of the hardest questions I've ever asked in my life. There was only one in Europe. And it's unsecured, and it was tied up to a port in the Netherlands, and I needed them immediately in the southern Mediterranean. I mean, these are the causes and effects in terms of high technology that live in the physical domain that we have to think about all the time. What happens when the data centers go down and we decapitate a country's capacity to manipulate data in any kind of a cloud or to undertake high-performance computing? It is a casualty that a nation will suffer that we've not seen the likes of before, given the emergence of these kinds of technologies.
Joe, you got to weigh in here. I know you're...
So this discussion here, ladies and gentlemen, is really one that you see is covering everything from technology to the human aspect of it. And most importantly is that this transformation that you're seeing towards the ability to wage a technologically enabled form of warfare is happening before your eyes right now. I'm going to draw your attention to the National Geospatial Agency, otherwise known as NGA, under Vice Admiral Whitworth. If you listen to Vice Admiral Whitworth, one of the big things he talks a lot about is the American way of war is a guiding context for the employment of high technology. And again, remember, NGA probably has the most compute in all of DoD and the IC, right? And not only do they have the most compute in DoD and IC, this ethereal organization sitting down in Spring Hill is now one that's actually providing all the way down to the individual warfighter, because we are learning how to move that data at speed and in workflows that we understand. And so a lot of the interactions that are happening with industry are really happening before your eyes and require you to actually look at take a nuanced perspective as you look at it from everything from the actual technology itself to the policy, because the tech will emerge before the policy. And the problem set to solve will emerge before all of that, because they're human problems, right? And the workflows there are really tied to the way that we fight warfare today, right? They will change and they will reflect different aspects of the technology coming in. But it really requires a consistent dialogue across the sphere, from policy to technology to implementers of warfare, to allow us to move quickly. Because otherwise what we tend to do is create a technology, go to implement the technology and say, wait, let's step back, let's review this, and then we re-roll it back, and then we figure a way to move it forward. The question is actually, how do we get the advantage? How do we find the emerging technology and leap forward with the policy concurrent to that technology, and really the acquisition strategies that will allow that to occur? And so these are some of the things, Emmy, that we have to look at as we continue to move forward. That will be how we measure progress. Looking at actually the American way of war and implementing the technology along that arc as we move forward.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just jump in here for a second. As Joe and I were talking earlier, I'm just back from a conference in Warsaw where we met with some Ukrainian drone operators who were talking about how quickly technology is changing on the battlefield. And their statement to us was, listen, in 3 months, it's a different war. We cannot use the technology that's 3 months old anymore. That would really challenge, and that might be a light way of saying what would happen, our military and the way we function. And one of the things that I found interesting that, Joe, I'd like you, because I think you've seen this with your work on Scarlet Dragon, was that in Ukraine, when we were talking with these drone operators, they are working directly with the technology companies, one-on-one. The engineers and the operators are being very honest with what's working and what's not working. And it was interesting to me to think about the motivations of those, field engineers deployed. You're working with some of these field engineers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could you talk a little bit about these people who are, these engineers from the companies that are working with the military? Yeah,
absolutely. So there is this misnomer that the vendor out there is trying to get the dollar from DoD a lot of times when you're engaging these engineers. It's really not the case. It's about learning. And remember earlier I talked about the Apex Predator and the Apex Programmer. And the traditional means to reveal a capability within DoD is to define the key performance requirements that you have. We have a bunch of different terms for it, but just think we have to define the capability we need. Then you go to industry, and industry then submits how they can do that. But in the world of, in a technologically enabled world where you're able to leverage the best in commercial industry and government capability, there really has to be this middle ground, right? And how do you bring the engineer next to the warfighter to actually reveal a capability? And so I'll give you an example of this. Computer vision, right? In computer vision, the coin of the realm, it's something we call labels. It's a picture. You've diagrammed and labeled everything on this picture so that the AI, as it's trained, can figure out from the classifier what exactly that object is that it's looking for. Engineers who have gone to school and they're the best in the world in this, through practice, look at a picture and see one thing. A warfighter sees another. I'll give you an example as a tank. An armored vehicle at 70 plus tons is going to leave depressions in the ground. Those depressions in the ground reveal themselves in these pictures that are being labeled. Additionally, a tank has a turret on the front. That's the gun tube, right? That gun tube can't traverse through a tree. So there's going to be a gap. Do you label that gap? Do you label in there the depressions in the ground that show where that armored vehicle moved? And so what we found over time is when the engineers were able to have the discussions with the practitioners, they began to look at what the practitioners through human cognition would look for in that image. And then they began to label against that. And so that turned technology at a very rapid rate. And that allowed us to go from what we would, a performance rating of somewhere around 10% for a certain type of object to 62, 64, 66% in about 30 days. And so it's that dialogue that you have to have with your engineers that allow you to start beginning to understand where you can make these movements forward. Another is in the concept of entanglement. So data, traditionally in military realm, will be under the intelligence officer, the operations officer, the logistics officer. And so those three data objects, whatever it is to whatever decision the commander has to make, sit in those three silos and rely on the humans that are at the head there, the intelligence officer, the ops officer, and the logistics officer, to have a dialogue in front of the commander so the commander understands it. Well, industry doesn't necessarily do that. Industry looks and says, I have an object, I have to move the object. The cost of moving the object is this amount in transportation, or I'm going to remove this rail car and do that. And industry can begin to project forward because every case here is monetized, right? And industry has the ability to tell you, I can move it this way in a much more effective means, a cost-effective means. Now in DOD, we're not necessarily, or in what we're doing in DOD, it's about decisions for combat. So it's not necessarily a cost issue. Really, our currency is how quickly can we make decisions and what's the impact on the commander's operational approach. And so industry has begun to allow us to move to a more modernized data structure, allowing us to entangle that logistics object, that operations object, and that intelligence object in a thoughtful and meaningful way, having used the roadmaps that they've done in commercial industry. And then on top of it, that's allowing us not to leave anything on the cutting room floor. Nor is it something that gets lost in a silo from the intelligence officer not necessarily talking to the logistics officer. The intel and ops, they have that relationship. The ops and logistics have that relationship. Now the ops, the intel, and logistics are all having it as an equation because they've entangled their data. One piece of data touches the other and then touches the other. And that allows us to get projective, where we're beginning to see into the future with something because we're allowing the computers to look at what is very narrow tasks, right? Things that computers do very well, we're allowing the computer to do. And so we're seeing more and more of that arise. And that is what's allowing us to get towards hyper war, allowing us to get decisions not only for what has to be done, but what will be done immediately after, or how do you gauge what is done immediately after you've achieved the condition you want, and then what is the effect on your logistics chain to get to the next set. You're getting 2 and 3 decisions ahead. We call that decision advantage, okay? For commercial industry, that's just getting an advantage over a competitor, right? But it's this dialogue you have to have because industry does this regularly. The military does it regularly, but it's a different type of data. And the question is, how do you leverage that capability and bring it over to what you're doing? And additionally, to General Allen's point and Pablo's point earlier, is how do we bring this in with the coalition? How do you exchange that entangled data with another country, Canada, France, Japan? How do you actually do that? And to do that efficiently in the commercial world is very different than in the governmental world, right? Because the exchange of data is inherently the place of government. It usually sits based upon treaties or agreements that we have. And so you have to be able to have that discussion with industry about this is how we're going to move data and then turn it over to industry to look at what those hybrid solutions are, because now you're truly hybrid, right? You're moving government data between, say, cloud instances in order to achieve a certain effect that have to be really spelled out into some sort of emerging or current treaty.
And you have NATO forces seeking to move data back and forth between sovereign nations, where those sovereign nations' data policies are governed by the EU. And this is three-dimensional chess, and it's very complex right now. This goes to the point that Joe made earlier. It's a really important point. 5 years ago, we could not have imagined the proximity of the private sector with the government in the context of trying to speed up the process of requirements development and acquisition. You can't have hyperwar if the military typhoon is unleashed on the enemy. And ultimately, it comes to a screeching halt because the defense sector is too isolated from the public sector in order to continue the requirements moving, the development, the advantage taken of technology. 5 years hence, where we are today, the conversations that he's having regularly is so advanced between the private sector and the public sector, the government, that to me, it's mind-boggling at this particular moment. And it will only enhance the capacity of putting the entire dimension of our interagency capability with the private sector to work to achieve the hyperwar capabilities that we want.
You know, I hear all of that, and I think that's right. But at the same time, you know, we had a conversation several months ago, John, about, you know, there's the speed of warfare. We've been talking about hyperwar.
Right.
And there's the speed of business. And then there's the speed of government in between warfare and business. And I think, as we talked about, that drove potentially some of these companies to not take contracts and to do some action, Starlink is the example, but Maxar, Capella, to do these things voluntarily.
Yes.
And I think that was a big shift. And I'd like, you know, both you and Pablo to talk about, a key question is, should that be the way it is? Is it right that these companies can and do volunteer? Are there other options, and what should they be?
Well, I think Pablo, in some respects, answered it already, but I'll state it.
Say it better.
Yeah, I won't say it better, but I'll just state it. Many of these companies acted because we were in desperate times. And you said it very well, Emmy. You have the speed of warfare, you have the speed of contracting, and you have the speed of government. And the speed of government lags every dimension of the emergence of the hyperwar environment in which we are finding ourselves increasingly embracing. Does the private sector want to be fully in sync with the government before it offers its services to someone in the battle space, someone who's under attack? The answer is of course, yes. But in the case of Microsoft, in the case of Palantir, in the case of Google, in the case of some of these other companies, they saw the storm coming. They did in the pre-conflict period, they did all that they could in the context of business practices to help this country, Ukraine, be ready to go to war. And then it was suddenly the storm broke, the war was upon Ukraine, and these companies made the unilateral decision, keeping the government briefed, but made the unilateral decision to apply its capabilities on behalf of Ukraine in a moment of national desperation. Now, what you'll hear in the boardroom, you asked me a little while ago about what you hear in the boardroom. What you'll hear in the boardroom is CEOs and COOs and CFOs, CEOs, executive officers, OOs, operations, and FOs, financial officers. You'll hear them giving instructions to those who are applying the company's assets in this crisis or this conflict, this war. You'll hear the instructions, capture the costs, the paper will follow. And maybe the paper won't follow. And again, I won't speak for Microsoft, but I'll speak about Microsoft. To this point in the war, Microsoft unilaterally has committed $400 million in services to support Ukraine in its war to defend itself against Russia and ultimately, however this unfolds, to its finality, where Microsoft will play a role in the post-conflict segment as well. So it was a function of desperation, I think, in many respects, the fact that corporations can move quickly, and the fact that in many respects warfare is evolving from a platform-centric to a software-centric environment. And as companies are able to evolve its software far more quickly than the department can ultimately contract for that software, they just go for it. and ultimately hope to reverse engineer the contracting process later. Now, let me just make a very important point. Everything that has been done by Microsoft and Palantir and Google and others has been done with great care to ensure that it remains in compliance with American law and ethical behavior. That is a given. The fact that there isn't ink drying on the bottom of a contract that definitively talks about a business relationship with Ukraine, we're going to get around to that someday, hopefully. But for now, it's about helping Ukraine in every possible way with these tech companies, ultimately to achieve advantage in the battlefield against the Russians. Pablo, I'll leave that.
Yeah, I think that those are really excellent points. In response to your question, I think that, so kind of going back to the spectrum that I talked about earlier, on the humanitarian side, I think that should be independent, neutral, and no, kind of control by the military. I think that the question about contracts on the more kind of military capacity side, it's kind of context-driven, as far as I can tell. There's a couple of things that come to mind. The first, certainly with the Starlink example, that's just a question of kind of operational control, right? That essentially kind of like the product or the service should do what it was supposed to do, and that ultimately the vendor doesn't have the flexibility to just kind of go sideways when when its CEO becomes unhappy about political circumstances. That should be the judgment of the in this case of DoD or another government organization that's managing that contract. Another reason to have a contract is, we talk a lot about kind of the technology startups that have been trying to kind of demonstrate their capabilities. From their perspective, ultimately a contract means, survival over the next, 12 to 18 to 24 months. Now, perhaps we should take those companies out of the venture capital world and think more about patient capital. And I know that the DoD has been putting in place mechanisms to do that kind of financing. But for the moment, the venture capital model is kind of dominant with a lot of these companies, and it is a pressure that they have, and so that's another reason to have a contract. But again, I think that this probably merits, kind of a, like a case by case or just an examination of precisely why you would want to have contractual privity between the company and the government.
But I think what I hear you're saying is that in circumstances, especially humanitarian relief, and I think Microsoft's been pretty outspoken on sort of making decisions based on a humanitarian North Star. Right. That maybe not for a contract at all. But when it comes to other capabilities, it's a case-by-case discussion. And I think, to that discussion, how should these coordinations be happening? I have to imagine that if you're the commander in the battlefield, you're trying to coordinate the overall effort, and some company's coming in off of left field with a new technology, that might throw off your plans a little, or if they're revealing kind of what they see, that could be challenging in a way. And so you'd want to coordinate with them. But on the other side, I think, Pablo, you and I have talked about this in the past, it's hard for small companies to collaborate across the entirety of the government. So what does communication look like between these two entities as you're running forward?
Well, in Afghanistan, I had an element within my staff that had a primary responsibility of being in close touch with all of the contractors in the battle space. So nobody arrived without notice. Nobody operated without permission. That doesn't mean I was writing a contract for them, but I needed to know what they were doing. And by and large, we had no difficulty in finding a way forward for them to be useful and productive. But there is an inherent responsibility of the commander to understand what's going on in the battle space. I'll also say, depending on the environment, the U.S. Embassy is also extremely important in this environment as well. Virtually every ambassador I've ever served alongside or for, depending on whether it was a war or a crisis, they lead the country team, and they are the president's representative to that country, and ultimately have full and complete responsibility to understand all of the American activity that's going on in that country, even Title 50, covert action. So they have a responsibility as well. And I had Ryan Crocker was my counterpart in Afghanistan. one of the greatest living diplomats that America has ever had, in my mind. He and I had weekly conferences about all of the other things that were going on in Afghanistan that were not purely military, that where there was a contractor dimension to it, or a civil military dimension to it, or our mutual work in civil society. And contractors were heavily involved in that.
I want to ask, sorry, judges, you want to weigh in there?
No, I think we're seeing this also occur right now through programs within DoD. So the different services have venues to bring in the technology and then to iterate on it rapidly with those companies, right? So an example in the Army is Scarlet Dragon. It's a 90-day process by which we iterate with capability. We reveal that capability to the warfighters. The warfighters seek to do the integration. They've got 90 days, and it's a sprint. And at the end of 90 days, the company learns, the warfighter learns, and then you have another 90 days to address, to make the next step further. And then you continue to move that forward. We've been lucky to spur that, not be lucky, we have been able to spur that forward within DoD through programs such as CDAO, or the Chief Data Architect's Office, taking over and running the GUIDE series of events, or Global Information Dominance Exercise, where actually they're able to have the contractual vehicles to get these limited sprints to move forward in support of larger programs. And then the question becomes, how do you do the transition? So once you've revealed a capability, how do you do a transition into an actual program or record down the road? And we're learning our way through this. Do we go the software acquisition pathway? Do we look at a more typical process that had been done in the past? Or is there something new? And I think that's what we're wrestling with right now as we kind of surveil and understand that. And that's from the actual software perspective. Cloud and compute gets very different because I think the way we viewed cloud 12 months ago is completely different than where we view cloud now. It is now another. It's beyond a commodity. It's battle space. That's right. Where we actually fight. We defend it. We ensure its security. We maximize it. How do we go to cloud hybrid compute between different echelons of war? How do we rapidly scale up compute in the civilian sector to run something such as a transformer, which is going to take a lot more compute than we traditionally work with? And with that, I will hand that off to Pablo.
Could I just, one thing, Emmy, when I was making the point, or when we were talking about contracting, I talked about control, and what I failed to mention is that in part, I'm concerned about that because, look, there's this kind of long conversation about how the European Union is ahead of the United States in terms of AI regulation. Well, the truth of the matter is that since the Obama administration, there's been a tremendous amount of progress that the U.S. government has made on AI governance. And in fact, since 2019, the John McCain National Defense Authorization Act, ever since then, every fiscal year since then, there's been an AI law, actually fairly major, that's been passed in the United States. A significant component of that body of law has been a huge focus, both at DoD and more broadly throughout the United States government, on the ethical use of AI, the protecting civil liberties, privacy. I've seen specific references to free expression and so forth, all related to AI. And in fact, one piece of legislation actually called on DoD to come up with ethical standards, which it did in 2020. Ambassador Jenkins earlier was talking about the release of an announcement in the Vice President Harris, who announced that there's a new kind of political agreement on the military use of AI that involves, I think, 30 plus countries. This is all kind of a long way of getting to the point that DoD and the U.S. government increasingly are very, very focused, have been very focused on the ethics of all this. And without That component incorporated into the use of AI and the deployment of AI by private companies in particular, the kind of these startups, we're missing a huge component that needs to be there, and there needs to be discipline around that. And so that, to me, is another, within this kind of concept of control, that's another kind of critical component of why, there really does need to be some sort of, if not contractual relationship, some sort of agreement there about how this is all being developed and deployed.
Yeah, and let me just flag for a second. We're going to switch to questions here in a minute, so get ready. But one of the other pieces of contractual that I found interesting and that came up in a discussion that we had, I guess, back in March, is that some of these companies that took action in Ukraine, they went at risk. They went at risk in the sense that their people on the ground around the world were taking risks. They had, I think in the instance of Microsoft and Google, they had many employees on the ground in Russia. You can read, if you look at their investor statements, it says in there is a chance we will get jammed or attacked by Russia. And one of the things that I thought was interesting is that, and Pablo, I'm sure you can educate me on this, under a contract, the individuals, the people, the company have at least a little bit more protection. Certainly not perfect, but when they act voluntarily, now you have employees of these American companies in potentially very dangerous situations. And I know this isn't an easy question to answer, but what should the government do when you've got companies, American companies, trying to do right, but their people are in danger around the world?
I guess I'll just say that they're certainly at risk. I mean, Ukrainian citizens walking around with the Enemy app, for example, identifying, kind of Russian forces on the ground and other things. I mean, they are at risk of, being, captured and treated like an enemy combatant. And I'm not super familiar with the laws that govern, military contractors, but I assume that they are treated something closer to a soldier than a humanitarian worker. So that is definitely a risk.
And their deployment would be voluntary.
Yes.
Their companies are not going to compel them to go. And I'm not saying that the burden of risk is shifted entirely to the individual, because the companies are obviously going to be very concerned about taking care of their families and making sure that they're as secure as possible once they're downrange and in theater. But this is, I think, a phenomena that we're facing now that is going to be characteristic of the future. Now, Joe and Pablo have talked about an inherent requirement, an inherent demand, we've talked about this word before, to accelerate certain processes as we go forward that gives us a time competitive advantage over our enemy, not just at the point of impact on the battlefield, but a time competitive advantage over our enemy in the context of the relationship of the private sector with the public sector inside of a crisis or actually going to war. And so I would think that as time goes on, this contracting process can also be accelerated in a manner that if a company like Palantir is going to sprint into the battle space because they have unique software that can make a difference very early in the conflict, that we can streamline and fast track contracting processes that can both cover the company for the purposes of liability and provide as much protection they can for the employees going forward.
Thank you. So we've covered a wide range of topics, I think, over the past hour. And the mic's open in the center if there's any questions. Sorry, I can't quite. I see someone moving to the...
Hi, I'm Isni.
Hi. Oh, yeah, please say your name and
Sure,
where you're from.
sure.
Hi, Nee.
Good afternoon. My name's Nee Simmons. I'm a non-resident fellow at Atlanta Council. I'm also Ghanaian American. A lot of my work is in frontier and emerging markets. Africa is a big piece of my work. With all the talk around emerging technologies and AI and innovation, there wouldn't be all this without Africa. Let's be very honest, especially around critical and rare earth minerals. I think if you talk to various policymakers and stakeholders, they'll say, yeah, we're very concerned about China's foray or Russia's foray in Africa. So my question to you is, what's your thoughts on that? And General Allen, we have a personal connection with Shirley Martha Higgins, so thank you for the add on the article. Thank you, appreciate it.
So, go ahead, sorry.
You want to just do one at a time?
Oh, sure, or we can do one at a time.
Yeah, fine. Again, I'll speak about, but not for, Microsoft. I can tell you that when Microsoft says it is a company for good, to complete that sentence, it is a company for the good of humanity. And it is, in fact, focused on its operations in Africa, ultimately to deal with many of the issues, economic development, grinding poverty, the effect of climate on large segments of the population, bringing the capabilities that Microsoft has with respect to data and the cloud and artificial intelligence, bring them into the economies of Africa. That is, in fact, an objective of the company. And you will see this more and more, I think, as time goes on. It is an absolute necessity. Africa, I think, from my perspective, and I've spent a lot of time on this in a previous position I had, holds, I think, one of the greatest opportunities for the world in the 21st century, in the latter half of the 21st century as well. But the African nations and African people need help with respect to the implementation of these technologies. And I think as American tech companies go forward, that has to be one of the principal objectives of their commitment to AI for good, technology for good. It has to be to bring to the global south and to Africa in particular these technological capabilities that can create opportunity within populations and in societies that to this point they have not been able to realize. To the other question or the other point you raised with respect to that recent article, which was spectacular actually, the whole issue of strategic minerals, rare earths, and other of the critical elements that are necessary to fuel technology from the ground up. We get wrapped around the axle about microprocessors in our cell phones and high-speed computing or high-performance computing in the cloud, et cetera. None of that is possible if you don't understand where the supply chain begins, and it begins when something comes out of the ground, by and large. Much of what comes out of the ground that gives the capacity for the world to enjoy microelectronic capabilities that we could not have even imagined 5 years ago has origins in Africa. And as we see political developments in Africa either close off opportunity because of corruption or a swing towards the Chinese, et cetera, for the so-called West to take advantage of those elements in partnership with the African countries to improve the lot of the African economy, to improve the educational capacity of the African people, when we're really in a competition for those resources now. Chinese competition is very extractive. The effect upon local government, the effect upon proto-democracies is not even a consideration, and Chinese leadership have told me that personally. The Russian presence in the region with the Wagner Group elements protecting Russian interests with respect to access to precious metals, diamonds, and other of the strategic minerals and materials is a real problem for Africa. It reinforces the negative trends in corruption. It victimizes the populations. And the vast, vast wealth that you find underground in Africa, which could fuel an enormous moment of progress for the African people and the establishment of stable, participatory government in Africa, we have to make that available to the African people through cooperation with Western companies and not shut it off because of the extractive mercantile attempts by the autocracies to have access to that. It is a major strategic issue for the future, how we'll secure the supply chain of these strategic minerals and make it available for good, as opposed to shutting it off to fuel the economies of Russia and China.
So we have 3 questions, and then if there are online questions, if somebody could, the online person's in there too.
Very well said.
So why don't we go to the next question?
Hi, my name is Alexander Mallinckrodt. I'm a senior in the SFS studying international security. AI obviously offers the opportunity to increase the tempo and effect of operations. And whilst there's been some discussion of joint doctrine, such as JADC2, a sort of clear operational doctrine regarding AI hasn't really been established. And as General Allen mentioned, the educational base sort of, if we're thinking about advancing hyper warfare without man in the loop, we might get to the point where it's beyond human ability to keep up with the tempo and extent of technological advancement in order to develop an operational art or doctrine. So from a sort of more academic theoretical perspective, are we getting to a position where the tactical and operational levels, the ways and means of war are indistinguishable? And then how does the industry-government relationship then need to adjust? Where will we end up on the spectrum between AI products which are tailored to and integrated with the operational doctrine and requirements, all the way to operational doctrine constantly being remodulated around emerging technologies and products?
Yes, sir. So operational and the tactical level of war will remain different. And it's because of what their tasks are to do, right? One's to project out and to set conditions for the other. They will accelerate and those horizons may shrink significantly. But the focuses will remain much the same that they are today at the foundational level. One sets conditions for the other. And that's why you had heard me said earlier, we have a foundational, a contextual, and a situational level that begin to equate the tactical, operational, and strategic level of war. But they're going to be more tied to technology, right? And so as technology evolves, and as important our ability to absorb that technology into formations evolves, that's what's going to dictate the direction we move in with those. Sir?
And I think this is a phenomenon we're going to have to come to grips with for some period of time. Technology is, again, galloping ahead, not just of policy, but it's galloping ahead of our capacity to prepare our leadership for the full employment of it going forward. And here, I think, is where industry can have an important role in this. Again, from the seat I sit in other places, Microsoft has just created something called the Microsoft Academy, which is intended to deal with some of these very issues for its employees. My guess would be that we'll begin to see a sharing of seats across both industry and the private sector to begin to bring those who are responsible for policy making, those who are responsible for policy execution, into the same room with those who are responsible for the technology that drives the other two. And right now, if I'm not mistaken, and Joe or Pablo could help me with this, typically as it relates to emerging technologies, the policy, the relevant policy follows it by a number of years. And we're seeing that really accelerate now. It actually was 7 years was the usual case. We're seeing that accelerate now. The AIEO, the voluntary compliance of the major tech companies with the White House on issues associated with AI for good and responsible use of AI. These are all manifestations of an attempt to create, as Joe said earlier, a concurrency or a coincidence of the emergence and the evolution of technology with the capacity both to create policy and to govern that technology as it is applied both in a societal sense but more broadly in the concept of conflict and ultimately in war. And I think we're moving in that direction. I haven't sorted it all out in my mind because, again, as hyperwar continues to be a function of the capacity to accelerate everything, our being able to get our eyes and our head and brains around what that actually means, to the point you made. Are we constantly iterating doctrine? We want doctrine to be relatively stable so that our services can apply the vast spectrum of responses to evolving doctrine. We can't do that to our services. So we have to have visionary individuals associated with the development of doctrine in such a way that it can account for rapidly evolving technology without whipsawing the services back and forth. A great Army general a few years ago, a fellow by the name of Rodriguez, once said to me, "You are what you buy." And when you buy a bomber that is older than I am, you're stuck with an airframe, or a tank that's heavy metal and it's almost impossible to retrofit or to integrate advancing technologies to it, you're stuck with that piece of equipment. What we're now faced with the advent of software being a lead in the context of developing military requirements and in the acquisition system, that gives us capabilities now to both innovate and integrate technologies in ways we couldn't before. That also means that as we acquire weapon systems, those two things have to occur together, and the private sector has got to be in that conversation from the very beginning, which is what Joe was saying is happening more and more today.
So I think we're going to go to a lightning round because we have 3 questions, if I can see them. And 2 minutes to answer them. So if everyone, you keep asking your questions, and then we'll go lightning round on the front.
Sure. Okay, I'll make it quick. My name is Samantha Dunlap. I work for Victory 6 Advisors, which is a strategy firm dedicated to supporting exactly this type of emerging tech company, specifically smaller businesses. And I wanted to address small businesses and their ability to assume risk in working with DoD. Most of our clients are smaller businesses who are in early stages of development on the BD side, or on business development, but they have capabilities that fill niches within the DoD, yet struggle to move within this larger defense community because of their status. Do you see a better way of allowing DoD to invest in these small businesses and work with them to accelerate faster? And what role do you think that they play in approaching these security objectives as smaller businesses?
That's great.
That question's instructive in and of itself, so thank you. That's a great question.
So let's get the next question, and then, like I said, we're going to get them all, and then we'll go.
This is a question from the online audience from Bruce Crawford. So it's about data poisoning. In the civilian context, there's been more discussion of data poisoning where, for instance, artists might not like that AI companies are training their models on the art that they produce, so they have tools to slightly edit the art in a way a person can't see, but actually makes the model that's trained on that art go haywire, so it can't do what it's supposed to do. Is there a military equivalent to that, and how concerning is that kind of capability for military AI systems that might be analyzing data that can be poisoned in similar ways?
It's a great question.
Okay, and then last one. Let's get the last one.
Hi, I'm Dr. Margaret McWeeny from the Potomac Institute of Policy Studies. This question is actually we had a panel back at our office. This is from Major General Charles Bolden, who is also a NASA administrator. He was asking, in theory, at a panel we had there, what about Elon Musk trying to turn the internet back on in Gaza after Israel turned it off, as a corollary to the assisting in Ukraine argument?
Yeah, thanks. Yep. Okay, so rapid fire. Is there a better way to help small businesses? Data poisoning, the military invented data poisoning in some laboratory. But why don't we go through, start with small businesses very quickly.
Well, I think it's whoever asked the question, it's a brilliant question. Some of the greatest innovations that we find in technology today are coming out of these small companies. And it is very difficult for those small companies to do business with defense. So what you find is many of these companies are attempting to undertake what they call the channel process, where they attach themselves to a larger company that has an existing big company relationship, Boeing or General Dynamics or something like that. And that just takes time. Joe mentioned it earlier, and someone else mentioned it, about the potential initiative where DoD explicitly gives access to competition to small companies. Because, as you say, some of them have extraordinary niche capabilities, great innovation, wonderful workers, data scientists, computer scientists, et cetera. They have an enormous capacity, but they're left behind because they're not able to get into the DoD contracting process. We've got to change that, and we've got to give them an opportunity, government money to accelerate their research and development, and then to play in the process of selection for requirements and acquisition, I think is an absolute necessity. It accelerates everything, and we're looking to accelerate and to give those younger and those smaller companies access.
Joe, do you want to touch on data poisoning really quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. The question on data poisoning is a very, very concerning one. We look at daily. to fight data, you actually have to fight data, right? You can't do it through a simulation. You've got to consistently do it and work with it to reveal lessons, and more importantly, in the case of data poisoning, to reveal abilities to detect it, right, within a workflow of what you're doing. So the answer is yes, we're doing it. I think the whole government approach right now, you see outlined in the executive order on artificial intelligence, really kind of captures this very succinctly when it starts talking about T&E, or test and evaluation of data. Because as you read into that, that really is about how do you make sure that your AI is performant, but what it's really getting at when you read into it is how are you managing your data, and how are you ensuring that the algorithm is truly, or the AI is truly revealing from you what you expect it to do, predicated on the right data set, and are you doing the right defenses of it? So yes, I think we're on the right track with it, but to do it, we actually have to continue to do it. And you have to do it rapidly and routinely so that you can stay ahead of the threat.
And then let me try and tackle the last question, just to say that I think Major General Bolden is asking an excellent question. I think that's part of what this panel was trying to explore, is should Elon Musk or should companies have this kind of power? And how should we think about it? How should we regulate it? I think that's still an open question. And so I would hope that the discussion continues far past this conversation.
I would just say, it's a great question. Because, more and more of humanitarian services are happening through kind of the digital space. And so we have got to figure this out, because this won't be the first time. And hopefully it's not just about Elon Musk. It's a broader conversation about how precisely both private sector, nonprofits, governments can deliver humanitarian assistance over these networks without interfering with, with an important military mission.
So I hope you'll all join me in thanking our excellent panelists for this discussion. This ends. Yeah, thank you. This is the end of the conference. I'm painfully aware that we're 5 minutes over. I want to give a special thanks to all the organizers, all the volunteers who helped us today. If you're interested in learning more, or want to go back and see parts of of what was discussed today, you can go to Kalaris.org. And then my final public service announcements for our students. If you would like to attend the career fair, it is now open at the Healy Family Student Center Social Room. And so please make your way over there. But thank you all very much for an excellent event.
Thank you.